Hi, Liz. Hey Liz, I'm going to give it a few minutes here for a few more people to jump on. We had 8 other people that are registered and have been messaging me back and forth. They're going to be jumping on. So I'm going to give it a few more minutes. And then what I'll do is I'm going to also put it live out onto the Facebook page here so it can be live recorded on there as well. If you have questions as we go, feel free to drop them in the chat box. I'll be going through and looking at those here as we go. Hello there. All right.
Hello.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing good. So, hey, in the chat box, I dropped a brief survey on there. If you wouldn't mind, if you could just take a second here and fill that out for me. It just helps me to know a little bit more about what we can do to help and serve you better. I'm going to give it about another minute or so, and then I'm going to go through and we're going to start the presentation here. The survey itself should only take like a couple of minutes at max. Hello, ladies. Hi, ladies, how you doing?
Hello.
Hi. I was just saying that there in the chat box, there is a brief survey. If you would not mind filling out the survey for me real quick here. And then, I'll give it like 2 minutes or so, and then we'll go ahead and we'll start getting everything rolling here with the presentation, okay?
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Okay, so hopefully everyone's had a chance to take a look at the survey. So tonight I want to spend a lot of time here talking about this concept of the perfect storm. And so for those of you who joined, I thank you so much for taking the time, because the intent for tonight is to help all of you to understand what is going on. So as a parent and a doctor, I've been in the same position that all of you are in. My name is Dr. Scott Haggerty. I am the owner of Elite Family Chiropractic with my amazing wife, Dr. Lena. And so we own a pediatric and family chiropractic practice here in the city of North Royalton in Ohio. I know some of you are not local. So as we go through tonight, a couple of things here that I want you to understand is that my wife and I had to learn this. We had a little girl, our amazing daughter, Olivia, who was struggling mightily. This is my little princess right here. And we had to search for answers to help her because she was struggling in a mighty way. You know, we were parents who were watching our daughter struggle with a million challenges that started very early. She had so many issues right from the very beginning, from being a colicky baby who couldn't latch, to cried all the time, to needed to be walked constantly to get to go to sleep. And the second you put her down, she'd be right back up and screaming, to a temperamental toddler who would scream and cry and melt down all the time, to deal with chronic constipation since she was a baby, to the reflux issues when she was a baby, to the terrible latch when she was a baby. As she got older, the symptoms began to evolve, and we started to see new things. When she was a toddler, it became horrible temper tantrums and meltdowns. And if you can relate to this, guys, feel free to drop comments beneath, because you know, one of the things that I want to do with this is I want to make sure that we're all, if you go, Liz, but if you go into that link where it says, can everyone please fill out this brief survey for keep.app. So the survey's in there. So as parents, we were watching our little girl grow up and seeing these problems begin to evolve. You know, at 3 years old, she's having temper tantrums and meltdowns that just were getting worse and worse, to the point where, you know, she was having meltdowns 7 days a week, and they would last 30, 45 minutes, sometimes an hour at a time, and they were for nothing. Trivial things like you would ask her what meal that she wanted to eat, and she'd throw a temper tantrum over the meal. You would ask her what clothes she wanted to wear to preschool, and then she'd throw a temper tantrum over the clothes. Everything was a struggle. And then there was the other signs that were starting to develop, where she was starting to show a lot of signs of anxiety. Things in school that should have been easy and were for the other kids, she would have crazy anxiety about doing them. She was starting to show sensory signs, where she was starting to get very antsy with certain textures, food textures, clothing that she would wear. We were starting to see a lot of tics starting to brew, and we were just watching this thing snowball. And so as parents, all of you know this, right? It's so hard to watch your child struggle, because all you want to do is help them. All you want is for them to live their best life. And my wife and I had exhausted everything. We talked to the pediatrician, we had done nutrition, we talked to other providers. everything that we tried, we were really not getting much of a result. It was getting frustrating because, we were watching her symptoms get worse. We were watching the behaviors get worse. It was causing crazy amounts of stress for both of us. And we didn't know what to do. And, by God's grace, and some of you may have heard this before if you're patients, but it was definitely a divine intervention thing, because when my wife and I were in chiropractic school, we met a doctor, Dr. Tony Ebel. If you've never heard of him, he's an amazing man. He is a good friend, and he is a passionate pediatric chiropractor, and he was the person who really created this perfect storm, and he helped us. And so in bigger picture, we had to look for help, and ironically, it happened in a way that we didn't expect, because when we were in chiropractic school, we met him, and it was interesting because my wife was very interested in pediatrics. I myself was not. I didn't actually get into pediatric chiropractic until we had to help our little girl. And I'll explain that in a sec. We had met him because he had a practice where he was working with kids with autism, ADHD, sensory issues, neurodevelopmental challenges, seizure disorders, immune issues, all that stuff. And my wife found it fascinating. At that point in time, I wasn't really in the headspace there. I was all about sports and working with athletes. But as time progressed and our daughter's symptoms began to really evolve, and we started looking for help, craziest thing happened. My wife, who had always been in pediatrics, had a background in pediatrics. Colleagues of hers started to post stories on their Facebook timelines, just like many of you may have seen from us, about kids that were being helped in their practices with challenges just like our little girl. And it hit us right at home. Seeing our daughter and all of these kids, and seeing the story of these kids overcoming these, like every parent, like probably all of you, we were saying, what in the heck are they doing? And so we reached out to each one of them, and they all said the same thing: contact him. So we got onto the phone with him, and we talked with him for a long time. And what the conversation's result is why we're here tonight. He explained to us that what our daughter had gone through was this perfect storm. It was this accumulation of different stressors on her brain and her nervous system that we were seeing snowball. They've been building up in her nervous system, and we were seeing them evolve into new challenges. She wasn't growing out of them like we've been told by your pediatrician. She was evolving into new, different, and worse challenges. And so when we had our very long 4-hour conversation with him, and he explained to us this perfect storm that I'm about to get into with you, it changed everything. One of the most profound things he said is that everybody that we had been talking to, they had all been looking from the outside in to try and treat a symptom, but nobody ever asked, what's the cause? And that hit me at home, because as a chiropractor, right, we always joke in chiropractic that DC stands for doctor of cause, but I couldn't find the cause. And so he explained to us this cause. The perfect storm is this cause that drives all of the other symptoms down the road, and we start watching these things start to build momentum. So as we dig in here, guys, I want to go and set the stage for you so you know what to expect. So first and foremost, not selling anything, okay? This entire thing here is to help you guys, give you information, help you to understand what is going on. So I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking from my heart about a lot of the things that are going on here, because I want you to understand in a different way, because the information that we're going to present is probably going to be very contrary to some of the things that you've heard. But I hope that all of you with your mom instincts recognize that this is probably a common story that all of you have gone through, because this whole perfect storm is an algorithm. And as we talk about this, you'll understand how this all brews. So let's dig in. So when we talk about the perfect storm, you have to understand that there's certain things where if you don't know where to look, then oftentimes you're going to miss a lot of these things. And so as we dig in here, guys, I want you to watch this real quick.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Oh, sorry about that.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make? The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Did you see it? So guys, one of the reasons that you can't see the image, I'm sorry about that. I don't know why that's not popping through for you. So the whole point of that video, if you've never seen this video before, the moonwalking bear, it's if you don't know what you're looking for, then sometimes you're going to miss it. And so as we talk about the perfect storm, it's this whole compilation of things where unless it's pointed out to you, in most cases, you're going to miss it because it starts so early on, right? It's this algorithm of things that starts to build up in you. And oftentimes it starts with fertility challenges and pregnancy stress. And these are these really early stress points. And there's some really cool research. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because there's a lot of other stuff that we want to get through, but that really points a lot of fingers back to this. And I'll cite some research articles later on so you can have a better understanding of this. But these fertility challenges and pregnancy stressors often set the stage because mom's nervous system is oftentimes stuck in a state of chronic stress, right? And when you look at this, right, stress is not just, I'm stressed out. Stress is, I've been through a lot. I've had physical trauma, chemical trauma, emotional trauma. I'm maybe living a crazy pace and lifestyle, and my nervous system is just on overdrive constantly, and maybe I can't shut down. And then we start looking at things like medical interventions and at labor and delivery. And I will tell you guys that this is a huge piece of the equation. When I learned this, and when I started understanding this, this was really hit home for me because our daughter's birth was, we planned on having a natural vaginal delivery, but we had a lot of interventions. Things did not go the way that we planned. And so the more you understand about this piece here, this is oftentimes a place where things really are table set, where things start to go down this pathway, because the more interventions that a child receives as a part of the labor and delivery process, the more likely they are to have a neurodevelopmental challenge of any type, autism, ADHD, sensory, behavioral issues, because of the amount of stress that creates. So you take these two stressors, a mom that's stressed out coming into the pregnancy, and the stress on the body during the labor and delivery process, these things can be huge stressors that can turn the nervous system into stress and overdrive right from the very beginning. And we start to see these things evolve, right? We start to see that the baby is stressed out. We see a lot of issues with colic. We start to see a lot of issues with sleeping. We start to see things like a baby's constantly, or the child's constantly stressed, constantly sick, challenged as a toddler. We start seeing like labels and diagnoses, like being told you've got sensory issues, or being told they're on the spectrum and they're just stuck. And by the time that they're getting into the teenage years, it starts to really evolve. And you start seeing the child's exhausted and depressed, they're angry, they're anxious, they're depressed all the time, because the nervous system is just going through this state where it's wound up and can only handle it for so long. The more the nervous system's stuck in stress mode, the bigger the symptoms become, but the harder it is for the nervous system to adapt to all of these things. And this is this whole progression. And this is what we see in our practice every single day, is we see kids coming in of all ages dealing with this. I just had a conversation with a mom today who her son went through this crazy amount of stress and anxiety with all this COVID stuff. And she just watched him go from having a lot of issues with stress and anxiety to literally just crashing, right? He'd always been stressed as a kid, and had all these challenges, a lot of the stuff we were talking about. But once everything hit with homeschooling, he just went down the deep end. And this is a really common thing that we're seeing with a lot of kids, is the stress of the last couple of years has really amplified this so much more, because their nervous system is more stressed. It's all of the things at school. It's the social isolation and the homeschooling and the wearing the masks and all the stress these kids are under that they've never been under before. And it's just really ramping up the amount of stress these kids are having to deal with, causing a lot of these behaviors to really escalate fast. And then, of course, you look at things like when you become an adult. And I know some of you can probably relate to this, because by the time you become an adult, you're dealing with this, right? You're burnt out, you're stressed out, anxious, still dealing with ADHD type symptoms, right? And I can say yes, because this was me before I became a chiropractic patient. I was dealing with all of these same things. And I know many of you, if you're self-assessing, we can probably look at each other and say, yeah, that's me too. So I want to talk to you about this concept, right? So if we think about stress, right, we think about stress oftentimes only in context of I'm stressed out. But what we see as a really common factor is that kids are stuck in stress mode, and they're exposed to it in amounts that they've never been exposed to before. And it's all around them, right? It's chemical stress, physical stress, emotional stress, with what we call the 3 T's: thoughts, traumas, toxins. It's a nervous system that's stuck on overdrive that can't get itself out of stress mode. And this is going to be a big foundational piece, because when the nervous system is stuck in stress mode, it affects everything. I mean, if you look at this graphic, right, you see all these things on here, because when the nervous system is stuck in fight or flight mode, there's a really important role. You can't be in growth and protection at the same time. So when the nervous system is stuck in stress mode, it literally affects every other aspect of neurological development. Then there's some really interesting things that you'll find, right? The more stressed out the nervous system is, the bigger the challenges become. One research study showed that the bigger the birth intervention, the higher the likelihood the child was going to have a neurodevelopmental challenge. And I can dig into this a little bit later on, but these are big things. Right? Early stressors have a really high connection to what happens down the road as the child starts to experience more and more of these stressors. And what happens is the nervous system becomes wired into stress mode. And it starts out like we talked about with these little symptoms, but they become bigger signs over the course of their lifespan. So I want to set the table here for an understanding. The function of the nervous system is to perceive the environment and coordinate the behavior of all other cells. And this is really important because the brain here is the master control system, right? And the brain is dependent upon all of the sensory input from all of the nerves that come from the extremities into the spinal cord up to the brain. And this is a relationship that's constant and perpetual, right? It's the same reason why, if you get a cut, the cut doesn't heal because you tell it to. It's because the nervous system perceives it and it leads the job of healing, right? The nervous system is built to be at homeostasis. It's built to be calm. It's built to be relaxed. But if the nervous system is not calm and relaxed, and the connections between the brain and the body aren't working the way that it's supposed to, the body can't regulate itself. It can't regulate sensory input. It can't regulate social norms. It can't pay attention. It can't focus the way that it's supposed to, because if everything that's coming into the brain is not coming in correctly, and the brain's constantly stressed out, there's going to be this whole cascade of effects that we start to see. So let's talk about this concept of altered perception. In chiropractic, we use this term called subluxation. And what is its altered function? So it literally means that what is coming into the brain is altered in the way that it is supposed to reach. So let's talk about neurodevelopment for a second. So the brain of the baby is built from bottom up, back forward. It means that the spinal cord develops first and then the brain. And the first system to come online is the sympathetic nervous system. And this is a really important piece because the sympathetic nervous system is what protects them, right? It's what drives growth and development from the spinal cord until they get to a place where they're approaching that week 28 mark. So in utero. And so when they hit week 28, the parasympathetic nervous system is supposed to come online to prep them for life outside of the womb. Because the parasympathetic nervous system is what regulates growth, development, healing, cognitive development, cognitive function, immune development, social norms, executive function, focus, attention. This parasympathetic function is critical to neurological development. And so when you start looking at these in context, right? So the first system that really needs to develop is going to be that motor system. It is the most important of all of the systems neurologically because of what drives the development of all of the others. And this is a critical concept to keep in mind because if we get proper motor development, we get proper brain development. If you ever had a kid that's an OT, right, they spend a lot of time working on motor things, trying to go and drive development of areas of the brain by doing motor activities, by using a sense called proprioception. And so let's talk about this here in terms of some research. So what I'd like to do is put things in context for you here. So this Harvard study talked about the way that genetics express. And this is a really important thing, right? Because when we talk about this study, it talks about the interaction of genes and experiences shape the developing brain. And although genes provide the blueprint for the formation of brain circuits, these circuits are reinforced by repeated use. We call that in neurology neuroplasticity, okay? And so we have to understand that nerves are always changeable. They're always able to refire and rewire. So if we start looking at nerves in terms of their ability to change, this becomes a really important concept because the environment the nervous system is exposed to is going to change the way that the brain and the body function. And so when you look at this in the bigger picture, if we are in an environment of stress constantly, whether it's in utero stress or outside of the uterus, so the nervous system, the more stress that it's exposed to, the more that it's going to alter the function of the developing brain. This is one of the big things that this study shows, and it shows it pretty well. So it shows a lot about these curves. And I want to spend just a second on this because if you look at development, right, the brain is in a rapid development phase from in the very early stages of life, going from birth all the way up through 12 years before the brain becomes pretty hardwired in terms of a lot of its neurological patterns. So there's this big window of super changeability where the brain has maximum growth, development, connection building, and growth in size. And when you get 12, the brain starts getting to a place where it's reached most of its maximum size, but it's also really starting to develop higher cognitive function. And that goes on in peaks for about the next 15, 20 years. So it's really important that we understand that during these critical developmental phases, the more stress the nervous system is exposed to, the more that it is going to affect the development of all things like focus, attention, the ability to regulate our emotions, process memories, social, emotional, all of those things. Now, when we talk about the perfect storm, right, one of the big things about this algorithm is we have to look at it in a very particular way. We have to understand, number one, how much stress has the nervous system been through? This is a big deal. And then we have to look at when did the stress occur? I know one of the things that we always look at is these two things combined, they help us to understand how much care for how long to help. And this is a big piece, right? Because if you look at the length of stress the nervous system's been under, if they were in stress in utero, right, because you were stressed out, mom, and then there was the birth trauma, and then there was any number of stressors afterwards, those things can add up to significant amounts of time the nervous system has been developing in stress, but it also tells us a lot about the changeability of the brain. The bigger the amount of stress, the longer it's been there, then the more work that needs to be done for us to go and be able to change the brain, change the neuroplasticity of the brain so that it can function better. The one thing I want you to understand is that even if the nervous system is stuck in stress a lot, and it has been for a very long time, one big thing that you have to understand is the nervous system is always changeable. Regardless of how much stress a child's nervous system has been through, there's so much that can be done to change the function of the nervous system, to get it to calm down by activating things like the vagus nerve, which we'll talk about later. So we need to talk about the neurospinal system. And this is a big deal because a lot of people really don't understand the connection between the spinal cord and the brain. And so the spine serves a really important role. It's a messenger. It is a communication network between every part of the body, and it controls and coordinates how all the information gets to the brain. This is a really important thing for you to understand, especially as it relates to why can a pediatric chiropractor help a child that is dealing with ADHD or sensory issues or emotional dysregulation issues or any of these things. Because when you understand what the spine does and its role as an organizer and a connector between the spinal cord and the brain, this will start to make a lot of sense here as we start moving forward. So when you think about this concept of the spine, right, I want to point to the way the spine functions. So if the spine is functioning the way that it should, here's what happens. The spine moves constantly. And the spine is always giving information back to the brain through these little muscles called proprioceptors. These proprioceptor muscles have a really important job. So proprioception, as a sense, is our brain's awareness of where we are in space. It's the same reason why I can touch my finger to my nose and not see my finger and know where it is, because every joint in the body is lined with these little proprioceptors. And those proprioceptors fire back to my brain constantly, telling me where I am. So when they do their job correctly, they have two roles. Number one, they tell me where I am and they calm my brain. Because when we have normal motion of a vertebra or a joint in the body, it secretes a neurotransmitter called GABA. GABA calms the brain. It activates the parasympathetic nervous system, activates the vagus nerve, activates the higher centers of the brain to help us to pay attention, to focus, to organize our sensory input, to regulate our immune system, all these things. If we lose motion in any portion of the spine, the opposite thing happens. This thing called substance P starts to reach the brain in much higher quantities than what it should. And what substance P does in the background is it starts to activate a stress response called the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response. The sympathetic nervous system, the more that it's getting bombarded by this background noise that's created from lost motion and misalignment of the vertebrae, what we call subluxation, the bigger the stress response becomes. And it's altering sensory processing. Because we know from research that when we lose motion in the spine, not only does it trigger the stress response, but it also alters sensory processing by the brain. And this is a big piece of the equation because one of the common factors with kids who have ADHD, it's not just the lack of focus and attention, it's also, there's usually sensory issues. There's also issues with perception of sound, right? There's also issues with the ability to go and regulate environmental stimuli. There's a lot of different things. That's why the brain can't regulate itself in environments where there's a lot of stimulation, because the brain can't do what's called attenuating. This is a really important term. Attenuation means that the brain has the ability to block out sensory input regardless of the environment. And if you've never thought about this before, let me give you an example. So if any of you bake, right? So let's say, for example, you go through and you make cookies. And when you take the cookies out of the oven, very profound smell, smells amazing. But after a few minutes, you don't recognize that smell anymore. So what ends up happening is that your brain perceives the smell and then it attenuates it. It says, you're not important anymore. I'm going to put you in the background. And then after a while, you don't smell it. But if somebody else comes into the room, they're going to smell it strongly because their brain is not attenuating it. They're still perceiving it. And this is how this whole thing works, right? The brain is designed to be able to go and attenuate sensory input at all times. Things like the clothes that you have on, right? Your brain should be able to attenuate out the sensation of the clothes. If they can't do that, then the clothes will constantly irritate you. If you're in a classroom and your brain has to be able to attenuate the sounds and the distractions of the kids around you, the sound of the clock, the noises that are happening from the kids tapping their pens, and they can't block that out, it's because they can't attenuate. And that underlying problem is that the brain is not getting proper feedback from the spine and the extremities to calm it, to help to go and keep the sensory system calm down so it can properly attenuate all the sensory input. And this is where we start dealing with this, because the other side is that not only do we have sensory processing issues, but there's also this constant arousal of the fight or flight system. And this is a big deal because when we are subluxated, and that's the term that we use chiropractically, right? When an area of the spine misaligns and gets stuck and stops calming the brain, that subluxation is a nonstop background stressor to the nervous system. And the problem is that neuroplasticity, the wiring of the brain, the more it's perceiving stress, the more stressed the brain becomes, and it becomes more deeply ingrained in the nervous system every single day that passes. And this is a huge issue, because what we need to understand is that all of these things, they're going to run in sequence, and there's a very predictable algorithm to how this thing will build up in the nervous system. So I want to run through and I want to give you an understanding of how this works. So let's talk about this, right? So when we talk about that loss of motion in an area of the spine, we need to talk about this term called dyskinesia. Loss of alignment and the resulting fixation, right? So if you think about it yourself, right? If you've ever had a stiff neck, right? The lost motion, the lost range of motion, that's lost kinetics, dyskinesia, okay? Now, when you talk about kids in birth, one of the reasons why we like to highlight this is because there's this really common path that almost every kid goes down as it relates to interventions, because interventions are super pervasive. I mean, we're talking like 85% of live births right now on a year in, year out basis have some form of an intervention. And those interventions are things like epidurals, pitocins, episiotomies, forceps, vacuums. There's issues with breech deliveries. I mean, there's a million different things. And all of these things, the more the intervention has to be performed, the bigger the stress on the baby's neck, called the cervical spine, and the resultant bigger potential injury. And I'm going to show you a couple of things here that hopefully will help you to understand this in more depth. So this is a short video here of a cesarean section. I want you to look at this and watch this and understand what I'm talking about. So in this video, the doctor here, these OBs are using a vacuum extractor. And if you've never seen this, sorry for a little bit squeamish, but I think it's really important that we as parents see this, because when I saw this for the first time, my head about exploded, because it told me everything, because I saw my little daughter's neck be tractioned so hard by the doctor, and I did not understand at that point in time what was happening to her. Now, this is an extreme example, right? This is a vacuum cesarean section. So this is like the worst of the worst, but let's watch this for a moment here.
Irritated.
Oh, there you go, fella.
Come on, buddy.
All right.
Here's of a girl.
Look at the amount of force he's using to pull her out.
Here's of a girl.
Now, I want you to watch this next piece.
There you go.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know why the video stopped short. So when you think about cesarean sections, just that little piece there with the vacuum, the amount of force that he has to use on her cervical spine to do that ranges anywhere between 40 and 80 pounds of axial traction. You can hear it in him, right? You can see he's struggling quite a bit to go and pull her out. OB stats on this show that this is, I'm sorry you guys can't see the video. I don't know why this is happening. So ADHD is actually, so I saw your question about ADHD being hereditary, and it's actually not. It's a misconception. So ADHD is definitely more of an acquired neurological situation. There's so many research studies out here that show that ADHD in terms of development is more of an acquired stress, where the nervous system is being pushed, right? We had this conversation a little bit earlier with a family. ADHD can be something where you can see it in a lot in families, but it's because stress begets stress. When the nervous system goes through a lot of stress, it's going to affect the function of the brain. So the brain itself has a pre-programmed way that it's going to respond to stress. The more stressed the nervous system becomes, the more difficult it is for us to pay attention, to focus, to regulate our emotions. So great question. I'm sorry you guys can't see the videos. I don't understand why that's happened. I've never had that happen before on one of the Zooms. So let's go ahead and keep moving here. So take a look at, can you see this image here that we're putting up here, guys? Let me know. So when we look at this kind of thing, right, axial traction. So this is what we're talking about, is the kind of force that happens during these intervention-based deliveries. In a C-section, and here's something that's really scary, right? So the C-section's minimum force is between 40 and 80 pounds. So that's the equivalent of taking your brand new newborn, picking them up by the base of their skull, adding a 40-pound weight, and then swinging them around by their feet. So it's still on the first slide. All right, let's stop the screen share. Let me see here what we can do. All right, can you guys see this one? Shoot me a message in here and let me see if you can, let me know if you can see this. Is that better? Can you see the new slides now? Okay, sorry guys, I don't know why you couldn't see it before. So let me go back then. I want you to see this. So let me just go back here to this image. So think about this. Think about this in terms of the amount of force that's put into a baby's neck at the time of a cesarean section. So this is a substantial amount of force. Look at the stretch, right? Even if we look at the video here, right? Look at the amount of force that's used on this poor baby. So watch how much he has to exert himself to go and do this delivery. You hear him? He's grunting.
Come on, buddy. All right.
That's 40 to 80 pounds going into that baby's neck because there's no vaginal assist. That's a tremendous amount of force that's being put in there. And so if you look at the research that follows on things like birth interventions, such as the cesarean section, one of the things that's really common is they show that as the greater the force occurs, right, with a cesarean section or a vacuum extraction, the bigger the likelihood of injury that there is to a baby's neck. And this is a big deal because I see this as a real deal, right? There's studies out there that strongly link the onset of autism to the birth intervention cesarean section. There was one study that was done. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the research studies, but this is important. There was a research study done by Dr. Sam Wang, where he talked about autism, and he said that the role of birth process, right, the role of the cesarean section and the later onset of autism, the correlation was stronger than the correlation between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. And the reason why is he talked about this thing called the developmental diastasis. This is one of these things where when the nervous system is put in a position where the messages aren't making it from the spinal cord to the brain correctly, everything's altered, right? This loss of kinetics has a cascade of events that we're going to see throughout life. Because when you look at things like these intervention rates, just cesarean sections alone have continued to escalate. You know, on a year in, year out basis, it ranges between 33 and 35% of babies are brought into the world by cesarean section. But per the Department of Health stats, we're looking at an 87% intervention rate worldwide, which is why we've seen an explosion in neurodevelopmental conditions like autism and ADHD and sensory processing issues, because so many of our babies are entering into the world with this kind of a stress on their brain and their nervous system right from the very beginning. I know there was this study that was done by a group of osteopaths, and they found that 99 out of 100 infants checked right after birth had one pattern of what we call subluxation. They call it somatic dysfunction, which is just the top of the spinal column between the base of the skull and the first three vertebrae. They found that in 99 out of 100 infants, they found some evidence that there was injury to or loss of normal motion, subluxation, to the upper part of their cervical spine, the neck. And so there's lots of research studies. I mean, here's just a small group of the research studies that I've gathered that link birth process to these later onset of neurodevelopmental challenges. The evidence is almost overwhelming at this point. The problem is like many of you, right, this is not being told in the mainstream. You're not hearing this from the pediatricians. You're not hearing this from the people that you trust, but the research is out there. There's so many different research studies that are being done that link this back. And part of why we're doing this is we want to change the tide. We want to make you aware of these sensitive periods in neurological development, that when the child's brain is exposed to stress at these very early ages, it can and will oftentimes have lifelong consequences. So let's talk about the effect, right? The next thing in the cascade is this thing called disafferentation. So neurologically, input from the spinal cord as it comes up the spinal cord and en route to the brain, in neurology they call it afferent, afferent, A-F-F-E-R-E-N-T, the root word. So if the spine is subluxated. It alters the input. We call it disafferentation. So normal input now is altered. So instead of having the calming, soothing effects of the spinal column and the organization that it brings to the brain, now what we start getting is abnormal input. And keep in mind, right? Abnormal input equals abnormal output. And many of you have already experienced this, right? I mean, think about it like this. If you moms, right, probably many of you, have you ever had a headache, okay? And you get that headache and all of a sudden you become nauseous. Well, you have to ask yourself, is that a stomach problem or is that a nerve to the stomach problem? And if your answer is it's a nerve to the stomach problem, you're right. Because the alteration of input coming from the neck, which is where your headache is coming from, that loss of motion, range of motion, fixation, subluxation in your neck, now is driving an alteration in sensory processing. Think about it, take it a step further, because we're talking the same area that birth trauma affects. When you get a headache, right, how often do you feel like the sounds around you are super loud? Or that lights are way brighter than what they were before, or that your sensory system seems like it's on overdrive, and oh yeah, you feel nauseous, or oh yeah, you feel dizzy. It's disafferentation, it's altered sensory processing, right? Kid has sensory issues. This is something that where at multiple levels coming up the spinal column, they're getting disorganized, disafferent information, and the output is I can't process sensory input correctly. So things like taste and textures, all that stuff bother me. So here's a quick little video. It's actually done by an OT group, but I love it because it really helps you to understand this. So watch this, and I'd love some comments what you think about this video after we get done. Here, go ahead and watch.
Some kids are really bouncy and can't sit still. Some kids aren't very coordinated. Some see food as a pile of toxic goo that hurts their mouth and jangles their taste buds. School might be a mysterious place where things don't make much sense. If this sounds like you may have sensory processing disorder, and we're going to explain it here. Your body has 7 senses: vision in your eyes, hearing in your ears, touch in your skin, taste in your mouth, and smell in your nose. And you have 2 movement senses: your muscles and your sense of balance. In sensory processing disorder, these senses don't communicate right with your brain. Think of the nerves connecting your brain and senses as a set of roads. Those roads should be smooth superhighways so that the senses and brain can communicate fast. If you have sensory processing disorder, then some of your roads are bumpy and rough.
So that video does an amazing job of explaining what is happening, right? Because if you think of ADHD, right, ADHD at its root is very much a sensory processing problem. The brain doesn't correctly understand how to go and attenuate sensory input, right, like we talked about. And the output to that is I can't pay attention, I can't focus. Oh, and by the way, my brain isn't being calmed by emotion, so I'm also having issues with emotional regulation and impulsivity because the parts of my brain that are supposed to tell me to do those things aren't working the way they're supposed to because my fight or flight system, my stress system is suppressing its growth and development. So let's talk about this, right? Because they talked about your movement sets, they talked about the muscles. That's proprioceptive input, right? It's the perception of movement, like we talked about before. This is a huge deal. It's a vital nutrient for the brain, and it's super dense in the upper neck. If you think about the spine in total, 70% of the proprioceptors in the entire body live in the spinal column, but 30% of that 70% lives right here between the base of the skull and the first 3 vertebrae, which is also the area that is most directly affected by birth process. So when that area is affected, it really alters everything and it creates a tremendous amount of noise. If you think about it kind of like this, if you were to go from the base of the spine up to the lower portion of the neck, right? And if there's subluxations there, they're kind of like Bon Jovi, like, you know, somewhat rockish. But when you get into that upper neck, it turns into Anthrax and Metallica. The noise becomes enormous. And if you get headaches, you get this. But think about this in going backwards, right? If the nervous system is getting nothing but this nociceptive, noxious sensory stimuli to the brain, then what's happening is that gate is always coming in and always flooding the brain with constant background noise that they cannot shut off no matter what they do. And that's what we're talking about. If you're not getting proprioception, if you're not getting GABA, then you're getting this noxious nociceptive input to the brain, and it triggers a fight or flight response constantly. Because what it does is it activates this thing called the gate theory. And it opens up the gates to this nociceptive noxious stimuli to reach the brain at a very high clip. And the more areas on the spine that don't move, the more nociception, the more this nasty stimulus that comes in. And all this stuff does is it drives the sensory system crazy. It drives the brain crazy, activates the fight or flight system, and it disorganizes all the sensory input coming into the brain, because that's disafferentation. Abnormal input equals abnormal output. And the thing of it is this disafferentation has a million different effects. Think about it. If you have a child that has anxiety, right, then it's affecting this area of the brain called the amygdala, which is the stress and anxiety center, and it affects everything. And the more active the amygdala is, the more we're going to see temper tantrums, meltdowns, anxiety, stress behaviors, because the brain is not able to calm itself down, because that parasympathetic calming effect isn't happening. It affects things like memory processing, area of the brain called the hippocampus, which regulates all short-term to long-term, right? I mean, how many times have you said to your child to do something and then they forget to do it 2 seconds later? It never made it into the hippocampus. The more stressed out the brain is, the more the brain is going to have difficulty with converting short-term to long-term memories. But the other side of it is too, it also controls things like spatial memory, like situational awareness. These things all are coordinated. The brain is always trying to coordinate, orchestrate how to keep us safe, how to keep us functioning, how to keep us working our best. And the other thing, and if you take it even one level higher, is that you've got this master control part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. Now, this guy here is huge because the prefrontal cortex is all executive function. It's what orchestrates all of the other functions of focus, attention, social emotional development, our ability to pay attention, our ability to focus, our ability to recognize social normals, our ability to control our impulses, our ability to regulate our immune system, our ability to recognize where we are in space, our ability to, process speech and have expressive and receptive speech, all run through the prefrontal cortex. And one thing that we know, going back to what we talked about before, you can't be in growth and protection at the same time. If we have an overly active sympathetic system, it alters and decreases the function and the development of the prefrontal cortex. Guys, this is the big deal, because disafferentation affects everything. And what it does is, the longer that it's there, it starts to trigger this thing called dysautonomia, this chronic dysregulation of the nervous system that triggers the fight or flight response to be on constantly. And the more that you're in fight or flight, the lower the function of your parasympathetic nervous system is going to become. Back to this. Stress begets stress. The more stressed out the nervous system is, the more difficult it is going to be for a child to be able to function the best in life. And listen, I know all of you are on here tonight because you are concerned about your children's potential. And that potential lives in helping to get them out of stress mode and getting their brain calm, getting the nervous system back in parasympathetic mode. And there's a few different things that we have to talk about to get that nervous system there. We know that there is one key, one way that science has proven that we can get the brain to calm down. We have to activate the vagus nerve. If you go online and you search for this, right, there's a million different hacks for the vagus nerve, but the vagus nerve is absolutely enormous, because the vagus nerve regulates all of the things that you're here for tonight. The vagus nerve is this connection to our gut. It's a connection to our heart. It's a connection to our lungs. It's a connection to our immune system, digestion, constipation, motility, and it's also what coordinates drainage of the inner ear and the sinuses. It controls reflux, right? If you have a reflux baby, right? I mean, think about this, right? We talked about before, if you have a headache, how oftentimes you can get an upset stomach, right, with a migraine. Well, I mean, reflux is no different than a baby who's having issues with their cervical spine, and the output is they reflux because the vagus nerve isn't properly regulating digestion. It can't keep food in the stomach. It can't keep the body going through the normal digestive processes and regulatory processes. So the vagus nerve is the key. And the research is very clear on this, right? We know that the vagus nerve is the key to calming sensory processing, but an underactive vagus is intimately involved with severe sensory issues, right? Lots of research studies on this. It connects directly into the gut brain. I mean, we know so much about the function of the vagus, but a poor functioning vagus equals a poor functioning brain. And this is where we have to really look at this and say, if we have this brain that's stuck constantly in fight or flight mode, then all of these other symptoms that we're seeing are the result of an underfunctioning vagus. And so we have to look at all of this stuff and say, well, what the heck do we do? Because we're seeing these symptoms, right? And this is where we start to get into a good place, because we know that all these symptoms have a lot of momentum. We know that, many of your kids have probably been dealing with these symptoms for a long time. If you're an adult who's stuck in stress, you've probably been dealing with this for a long time. But this is where it gets really good, because I want you to understand that what we see when we look at things like our scans is this thing called dyskinesis. Dyskinesis is is errors in energy output and expenditure. So if you have a hyperactive kid, do you think your kid's using energy effectively? If you have a kid that's got low tone or is depressed or is lethargic, do you think they're using energy effectively? But the best part about it is it is a reversible pathophysiological state. This is huge because if you can change the energy output, right? You change what comes in, you change what comes out. And we know that dyskinesis is the result of long-term sustained incorrect output, disafferentation, that drove the nervous system down into fight or flight mode, wore down its ability to handle stress. And the symptoms as they roll, we see this cascade, this algorithm, where the stress becomes harder to adapt to. And as they get older, the symptoms become bigger, and the problems become bigger, and the meltdowns become longer, and the tantrums become bigger, and the sensory issues become bigger. But we can start to change that if we can change what's coming in. So let me give you an example. One of the things that we look at all the time is we look at scans, and scans help us to quantify. So, I'm a data-driven person. If anybody knows me, I'm a bit of a geek. I like science. I like science quite a bit. As a parent, when I started learning about this, right, to help my little girl, and I understood these scans, it literally, my head exploded. I was like, oh my gosh, this tells me everything. The very first time we pulled a set of scans on my little girl, they look very much like the scans that you see on the left side of your screen, just crazy amounts of activity. Now, you don't even have to be a scan interpreter like my job is, but you can notice that if you go from left to right on the screen, scan 3 looks a whole lot better than scan 1, right? If you look at these colors, right, white is normal. Green is 1 standard deviation above normal, blue is 2, red is 3. These scans on the left side have lots of activity. Think of that as noise. When we're getting that kind of activity, there's tons of noise coming into the brain, right? This is actually a pretty typical pattern that we see with kids that struggle with ADHD. Too much input, the brain can't organize it, so the brain is getting all this disafferent input, and what we see from an output standpoint is we see the behaviors, we see the sensory issues, we see this high energy state. And as the brain calms, as we start going through and adjusting, though, we start watching the nervous system begin to calm and reorganize. As we get rid of the disafferentation, we get rid of that dyskinesia, and all of a sudden the brain is able to start to refire and rewire and start to calm itself down. And progressively over time, it gets better. Now, guys, I want to share with you a story. This is our little buddy, Evan. So Evan, cutest little dude in the world. And I want you to watch this. I want you to see where Evan was, and then we're going to show you another video of where Evan is now.
Bye, Aunt Kristen. See you later.
You see the lack of engagement?
Oh, no?
Does he look irritable?
Did you have fun?
Does he look connected?
Did you have fun?
No eye contact?
Yes? Yes? Do you love Aunt Kristen? Say yes. Yeah. What? Bye, Aunt Kristen.
Now,
We'll see you later.
Now, I think all of you can look at that and realize that's not a very connected little boy, okay? So soon after this, Evan received a diagnosis of autism. And of course, like any mom, his mom was panicked because she didn't know what to do, right? And so she reached out to say, what can we do to help him, looking for resources, and he was referred in. And then so when Evan came in, the scans that you see on the left, these were his initial scans, like really stressed out, really disorganized. This top left scan that's the epitome of dyskinesis. His nervous system was just crazy out of control, really, disorganized. Output was out of control. This bottom scan here, this top scan, dysautonomia to a T. This is exactly what we're looking at. Now, come back here and look at Evan just a few months into care.
What's that one? What is it? A dog?
Yes, I am.
Yep.
I don't talk.
What's that?
I talk.
A truck?
Fast, fast, talk.
Fast truck.
Fast, fast. Then fast.
What's that one? No, this one. What's this one? A snake.
I'm going to do it again.
So look at the difference, just a few short months. Look at the eye contact. He's more connected. He's speaking. I mean, a million changes. His mom, if you look on this, right, look at all of the changes that she marked for him. So, I mean, it's just amazing how much things changed because his little nervous system was just connecting and it's healing. And, you know, by getting rid of all of that noise, his nervous system was finally able to reconnect and heal and do what it had been trying to do all along. But all of that noise, all of that stress in his nervous system was causing his brain to be off track. And guys, I want you to understand this, right? This stress is such a real thing, it was such a real factor in our kids. But the great part about it, the most amazing part about it is no matter how far down the road these kids are, if they're changeable, these things can be undone. I want to share with you just a couple of stories here that I think will give you some context. Because, you know, I promise you that, you know, many of you are sitting here and you're stressed, right? Like you're dealing with these things on a day-to-day basis, but there's real hope and help for these kids. Right? Because I saw it happen firsthand to my daughter. We went from 7-day-a-week meltdowns, and in a 4-month span, my daughter stopped having meltdowns altogether. She stopped having anxiety. I mean, it was crazy. I mean, I watched the constipation go away. I watched her tics go away. I watched her OCD behaviors go away firsthand. As a parent, seeing that firsthand, like it changed everything. Because, I mean, watching what happened to her literally changed everything about the trajectory of my career. I said, I can't do sports anymore because my daughter needs my help. And then kids like my daughter need my help. And we started seeing all of these changes in all of these kids. And it was just amazing because as a parent, nobody wants to see your kids struggle. Nobody wants to see them not be able to go and enjoy life, not be able to go and, you know, socialize, have meltdowns and just see them struggle and not be able to sleep and all this stuff. But like, when you look at like stories like this, right, like Evan's story or stories like this little dude, David, it's pretty amazing because, you know, when David came in, super explosive temper, like a lot of issues, like very, very temperamental, like would melt down multiple times per day, just really struggling in life. The scans you see on the left side, these are his initial scans. See all the reds, super disorganized, see the pattern on the bottom. That right there is subluxation. Those super high energy patterns, all the torque on the spinal column, it was from birth. He'd had a really traumatic labor and delivery, had done just been super stressed out his whole entire life. And as he got older, elementary school age, the meltdown started to really come and the focus and attention issues. And of course, then COVID hit and it all went to heck because now he's melting down constantly and he's starting to become aggressive. So mom and dad were looking for help. They were desperate for help. They came to a workshop in person like this. And they were looking for help just like you guys are. Got him into care. Several months passed by and we're starting to see that all of these things are completely unwinding. Behavior is getting better. And it started within the first couple of months, we saw huge changes in his behavior. Mom almost couldn't believe it because it had been so deep for so long and so bad that she almost like was second guessing herself. But, you know, by the time we get done with his entire care plan, he'd stopped melting down, period. And, oh, by the way, he was coming off of his ADHD meds, which is pretty darn cool because it had been something that mom had already been stressed out about because she didn't like the effects of the meds, but didn't know what to do. And so we worked together with his primary care and we were able to get him off all of his meds. Now he doesn't need them, which is pretty darn cool. These scans here on the right side are a more recent set of scans, but look at how much calmer they are, right? Not perfect because he's still changing, but tremendously better, much better input to his brain, much more organized. His nervous system has come a tremendous way. So this is our buddy Deb, and her son came in for ADHD, and just listen to what she says.
All right, so I have all 3 of my kids going to chiropractic care. So we started seeing Dr. Scott when my youngest, he's now in 7th, so he was in 4th, and he was just really withdrawn. We knew he had a diagnosis of ADHD. We've tried medicine, all sorts of medicine. And he was just, as a result, I think, becoming very, very withdrawn and not wanting to make friends, not talking in class, and just not himself at all. So we started chiropractic care with him initially, and I didn't tell any of his teachers we were doing it. Within 3 weeks, I swear, within 3 weeks, his teachers were emailing me, oh my gosh, Tyler's smiling, he's raising his hand all the time, like, what is going on? This is amazing. And then at that point, I had said, like, we had started chiropractic care. So absolutely huge, like, life-changing results for him. Just getting, I mean, his grades were great, but just in terms of socialization, participation, interaction with others, it's an amazing.
So we take care of a lot of kids regardless of kind of diagnoses and labels because they don't really matter to us. So like Lincoln, he came in and he had some different challenges. So Lincoln was a child who'd been diagnosed with autism and ADHD. So here's a little bit more about his story.
Hi, my name is Carla Lucas, and we started coming to Elite Chiropractic after my husband's been for a back injury. Afterwards, we brought our son Lincoln. He is autistic and has ADHD to help with his sensory needs and meltdowns. The clinic has been just completely amazing. Lincoln has been he has changed. He's gone from just melting down at the drop of a hat to being able to express his emotions and feelings by coming weekly. And he is able to maintain conversations with us and be able to do other things instead of his just preferred activities. We're so grateful for Dr. Scott, Dr. Brandon, and Dr. Lena because they've completely changed our lives for the better.
So I love that story because I hope that, you know, if you're in the middle of the storm and you're dealing with this and you're looking for help and you're looking for resources, there is real help available for these kids. I mean, so the moms that you just heard from, Deb is a professional psychologist, school psych. So this is her wheelhouse. You know, Carla and her family, they've done a million different things, right? Special schools and counseling and ABA and a million different things. And what they came in for is because the things they were trying weren't working. They were looking for something different. I can tell you that regardless of where you are, if you are looking for another way to help your child, you're looking for something that's going to get really to the root cause and help their brain to begin to change, you should really start trying this. You should really start looking in this direction and see what can we do, because the biggest thing is right, you know, you've got to take these action steps. Like you got to keep asking questions and finding answers. And you got to start removing the three T's, the thoughts, the traumas, the toxins. And honestly, I think the best thing that we could offer to you is if you want to get your children scanned, if you are local to us, happy to help you. If you're not local to us, I can also connect you. There are, you know, 700 doctors nationwide who do what we do. So I would be happy to make connections for you so that you can see what's going on. You can see what the child scans look like. You can see what can be done, because the only way that you can ever change things is start looking at, you know, what is going on inside, get the answers, and then get a care plan developed. That's the best thing that anyone can do for you, is to give you the actual answers based upon your child's case history so they can get help. I want you to, I get a common question about, a lot of people ask about how long does it take? And the one thing I want you to keep in mind is it is individual to the child. So the longer the stress has been going on in the child, the deeper, more deeply rooted it's going to be. So we have to take all these things into consideration when a care plan is developed. When we look at things like the scans that we showed to you, and there's multiple different pieces to those scans, what they allow us to do is to be able to get a 360-degree view of a child's nervous system so we can see how adaptable they are to stress. What is coming from the brain down the spinal cord through a thermal scan, and it registers differences in the changes in the nerve roots from side to side, so we can see how balanced, how calm it is. And then see the input through the EMGs. And we can look at these things and they give us the information necessary to assess what's going on inside the child's brain and then come up with a plan. And that's the biggest issue, is getting a plan. The more information we have, the better plan we can make. And then we can start putting things together in terms of time and frequency. So I know I get a lot of people who also ask what the scans measure. And so we've talked about some of these things. You know, the nice thing about the scans is they are very graphic. They allow us to be able to look at stress adaptability, so we can see sympathetic and parasympathetic balance through our heart rate variability scans. And many of you, if you have like an Apple Watch, they have heart rate variabilities in there, not used the same way as what we use. So an HRV used the right way can give you a really amazing understanding of how deeply rooted the stress is in your child's nervous system. And we can see balance. We can see how dominant they are towards the fight or flight system, how stressed out the nervous system is. Or in other cases, like a child has a growth spurt or something like that, or they're sick, the parasympathetic system kicks in. And we see these different signs in the way the nervous system is able to adapt to life. And it tells us a tremendous amount of information, both about where they are when they start, but also over time, as the nervous system heals and recovers and starts to get stronger, we can also track it. We can look at the thermal scans and the EMGs, and it gives us this big picture of what is happening inside of the nervous system, so we can track the changes in the brain over time, so that as a child is going through the course of a care plan, we're able to go and measure it, quantify it, looking at the subjective, right? Because the goals matter. All the things that you see your child going through, we're going to always be asking about those because we care so much about those things. But we also need to be able to measure that what we're doing is also effectively changing the brain for the long term, because that's how the care plan is really designed, is to take the brain from a state of stress and get enough momentum built up so that the brain begins to refire and rewire and then learn how to maintain it. And so that as we go through and we track this, and every 12th visit we do a scan, we watch the brain change, we measure it and we quantify it. And as the brain heals and refires and rewires and stabilizes, we can know with certainty that we've not just put a Band-Aid on it, but we've gotten the brain to change and stabilize and be able to maintain those changes long after the initial phases of care. So I hope this was helpful. I know a couple of you ladies that are on here, we already know each other. If you have questions, please feel free to drop them. Ms. Santiago, I'm going to go through, I know you may have some questions, so I'm going to pull up a quick link here. I'm going to get out of the share. And what I'm going to do is, if you would like to ask me some questions, I have a link I can share with you if you want to chit chat a little bit more about some specifics off air here. I'll get you over a link so that you can reach out to me and we could schedule a time to talk, just do a quick consultation. Because I know oftentimes that, there's some questions that you may not be able to answer on here or may not want to talk about in here, and I'm happy to go through this with you. So let me go ahead, I'll share this link here in the comments, and feel free to go ahead and use that link if you want to set up some time so we can chit chat. Thank you, Liz. I appreciate that. I hope you got lots of value out of this. Ms. Santiago, I hope that this was helpful for you as well. Liz, I hope this was helpful for you. Anybody that's watching this on Facebook, I also hope you got some value from this. Learned quite a bit about what is going on, why this has been brewing in our kids, and how we can start looking and helping them. Because, one of the things that we know for certain is that the more that we can change the nervous system early, the bigger the changes we can make and the faster we can make them. But regardless of where your child's starting point is, it doesn't matter. We take care of kids who have autism, kids who have OCD issues, kids who have seizure disorders. And, like I've mentioned before, we don't care about the labels. We don't care about the symptoms. What we care about is helping your child live a better quality of life, because they're not a label, they're not a diagnosis. They're your child, they're your little baby. And they deserve the potential, right? They deserve to be able to go and have the potential reached. It's helping their brain and their nervous system to function at its best so your child can live their best quality of life. And that's why we do this. So if anybody has questions, feel free to go ahead and use the link. If you guys are watching this on Facebook, I'm also going to go ahead and drop that link in as well. So if you have questions, you'd like to learn more, you can go ahead and schedule a 15-minute consult with me, and I would be more than happy to answer any questions that you all may have. Okay. So thank you guys all for being on tonight. Hope you enjoyed this. Thank you so much, and God bless you all.